We're really pleased today to have with us Dr. Chris Simpson, who, like me, is a professor at Texas A&M University Commerce. And Chris and I have known each other for really, I guess now, over 10 years. We were both doctoral students at the University of North Texas and went through that program together. And fortunately for me, Chris came to work at the same university where I teach and has been there several years. And we're real pleased to have Chris with us today because we're going to talk about grief, and Chris is, this is one of his specialties. He has presented on the topic at conferences and various places and done some training in the area, and also has published on the topic of grief. So why don't we start with just something for the viewers here. Why don't you share with our viewers any lessons you've learned about grief that you think would be helpful to therapists?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm appreciative to get to do this with you, so this is fun. As far as what I've learned about grief, probably the first thing that I think of when I think of grief is I think as counselors we're often oriented to think in terms of problems that people have. And grief, I've learned to think of grief in terms of, instead of a problem, to think of it more as a course that a process that we all have to go through in life. And it's an experience everyone will have. Sometimes it's more complicated than others, in the form of a small child losing a parent, rather than, say, an adult losing an elderly parent. The first example can be more complicated. But nevertheless, it's, as opposed to a problem, I like to think of it as a life event that can be problematic. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because often when counselors, I think, see people who are grieving or bereaved, there's often the perception that I need to move them along or I need to help them fix something. And often, grieving, like a lot of other processes that we go through, is about being present, being willing to hear and listen, and being a fellow traveler, often more than somebody who is here to facilitate me fixing a problem that I have in regard to grief. The other thing I've learned about grief, kind of in that same vein, is that it can go a couple of different ways. What we'll, I no doubt, talk about at some point here is complicated grief, where grief can serve to help someone sort of disintegrate. Grief, normal grief, for lack of a better term, often can help someone make meaning in life and help them actually grow. And that ties back into it's a natural process in life. So the first thing I would ever, if I'm to advise anyone, would be to see grief as a process in life and a potential for growth, as opposed to a problem that we need to nip in the bud.
Well, I really like several things you said there. One of the things that I wanted to go back to was you talked about moving someone along, that could actually be, I guess how I envisioned what you said is that when the therapist is working with someone who's grieving or in some kind of grief process, that all of us as therapists have choices that we make, and maybe a fork in the road, and I could go this way or that way. And it's also easy as a therapist to have an agenda for the client and to think, well, he needs to move through this quickly or she needs to move through this quickly. And in humanistic Santre therapy, we have really a philosophy that fits what you said perfectly, and that is just being with the client where he or she is. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that moving along. So you said, I don't remember how you put it, something like it's a mistake to you can get caught up in that. So talk a little bit more about how that wouldn't be helpful.
Sure. Well, the first thing I think of are stages of grief, which we've all heard of before.
Well, go ahead and talk about that some, though, because even though we may have heard of them, it'd be helpful to review that a little bit.
Sure. Without necessarily talking just specifically about each stage, but for example, denial is something that is a stage that may be experienced in grief, and the unfortunate thing that has happened in that process of these stages that have been, and there's many different models of stages now. Obviously in the late '60s, Kubler-Ross came out with the stages of grief, and I don't think she ever intended for those stages of grief to be seen in sequential order. In fact, I think that she was really prominent about saying that these aren't necessarily to be seen sequentially, but these are stages that someone can go through, and they can go through them in an order. They can revisit those stages over and over again. Case in point, for a child who loses a parent, they may very well go through denial as a child, or depression as a child, or avoidance of wanting to feel those feelings that go along with that. They work through it as a child. Maybe they go to a therapist. Maybe they work through it naturally. And then they get to graduation, or prom, or somewhere where parents might be involved again. And my dad, who died when I was 6, and I worked through that, now it's father-daughter dance. And all these other kids have dad there. I don't. I may go through that again. Graduation may come. Other people have dad there. I don't. I go through that again. So again, it kind of ties back into it's a life process that we may have to go through several times. So those stages can be revisited, not necessarily dealt with in sequential order. That's I think the important thing to point out about any kind of stages of grief.
So getting back to that moving along or kind of rushing, I guess as I listen to you talking about viewing it as a process, that there might be, the therapist has a role, but the role, and I guess it might be to facilitate the process or support the person in the process, and that rushing it or trying to force it is a bad idea. So.
Well, I'll even move away from a therapy example and just go to, let's say, a layperson example of mom, dad has died, and kids are all young adults, and mom is going through some pretty outward grief processes. For example, she's in denial. And maybe she's not in denial of the death, but she's in denial about maybe doing certain things that have to happen when someone's died. Mom, we need to go to the funeral home and we need to work out the services. Oh, we don't need to do that yet. It's we don't need to work on that yet. We've got plenty of time. Or maybe it is just flat out denial. Hey, Mom, we need to go to the funeral. Oh no, we're not going to go to the funeral because your dad's going to come through the door any moment. I mean, it might be that extreme. It's important to note that that's not something that we need to address immediately, and that, hey, you need to stop doing this. You need to get out of denial, and you need to start acting in reality. That's not necessarily what needs to happen. It's very normal for somebody to go through some really extreme grief reactions in normal grief, up to maybe a couple of months or even several months after the loss. Somebody might go through that. So it's important, as whether it be a layperson or a counselor, a helper in some regard, to note that this is where the person is at this time. And it's not necessarily going to help to try and, as we've talked about, move them along. This might very well be their way of taking care of themselves. Not necessarily knowing that they're taking care of themselves that way, but they going through this process they're where they need to be at the moment, and we can continue to try and peck away at the shell, if you will, but we don't necessarily need to crack open the egg. If that's making sense.
Yeah, I like that image, and I guess part of what I'm thinking about, you mentioned timing, and that initially that some of these stages, that it may take a couple of months, it may take several months, And so I'm thinking of, I guess, a couple of different scenarios. So one would be that someone who's going through grief, let's stay with adults, we'll talk about children later, but let's stay with adults for now. So an adult has lost a spouse or whatever, and is 2 months in or 4 months in or 6 months in. I mean, people are going to come to therapy at various points. I mean, they may come pretty early in the grief process or not. So how would the timing affect what a therapist should do or think about this?
What I often like to think in terms of normal grief. And by the way, there's so much research that still needs to be done on normal versus complicated grief, or how long, what is normal grief and how long does that take? I mean, you can go out and look in the literature and find a variety of different times on that. However, initially, kind of what I like to think of when I'm working with somebody is, okay, if they're going through the normal grief process, after several months with the help of family, with friends, with re-engaging in life to some extent, there should be some dissipation of symptoms of grief. There's more of a checking back into the things I used to do. There's more re-engaging with friendships. There's less blaming or assigning blame to doctors who didn't treat as well as they could have, or what have you. And when there are signs of that, to me, that's a sign that when I can measurably notice that from the beginning, when the loss occurred, to now, let's say it's 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, there's some change, there's some decrease in symptoms. To me, that's more of a sign to, okay, perhaps we can try and do some things to facilitate further working through your grief. If it's been several months, let's say it's been 6 months, and this person has not only maintained their level of isolation, but maybe even gone down in their functionality, then I might that might encourage me to back away a little bit and perhaps not try to push change necessarily. In other words, infusing reality, for lack of a better term, on them so soon. Maybe we just work at how are you feeling right now, and work on that, as opposed to how are you gonna move along? How are we finding meaning in life right now? I might be much simpler and let's just talk about how are you feeling right now? How are you dealing with your feelings right now?
Well, I appreciate several of your comments. One of the thoughts I had was, when I listened to that last part, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, of just being with the client, or even if it's a layperson, being with the person where he or she is, trying to be supportive with where they are. But what I've found is, especially really among white Americans, is really an impatience with, in general, with, you need to get on with your life, you need to move on, sometimes really quickly. Sometimes not a month in, or 2 months in, or 6 months in, sometimes a week in, or whatever. Some of my clients have been, people are saying that to them. You need to move on, and it's too early to move on. How has that worked in your experience with clients?
I predominantly work with grieving children, but along with grieving children comes grieving caregivers, grieving parents, grieving grandparents, depending upon who was lost. And there very much is, especially with children, I've seen some cases where the funeral was on Tuesday and we have the kid back in school on Thursday, which maybe the child wants to go back to school on Thursday. And something to point out in this is that if the person wants to try something, it's not necessarily my place to deny them that. As long as they have support and they have a way they can back out if they feel like the water's too deep for them, then that's good. As long as we let them know, hey, this is, if you want to do this, do it, and I'm here for you if if you need to back away from that. But often it's believed that, well, we've had the funeral, we need to get them back into normalcy pretty quick. And especially with children, there's a lot of, not a lot of, excuse me, I have experienced caregivers maybe saying to a child, we don't wallow in our sorrows. We don't sit in that stuff too long. It's not good for you to sit in that. When really the person's just grieving, and it's very natural for them to feel sad, angry, lonely. In fact, moving back to anger, it seems to be, you're speaking of good old North American, Caucasian culture. It's okay to be sad, it's okay to be lonely, but it's not okay to be angry. Or maybe vice versa. In some cases, it's not okay to be sad. But it's okay to be all of those things. It's not my place, whether I be a therapist or a lay person who's there to help, to gild any feeling that a grieving person might be having, and to let them have it, let them have those feelings. And perhaps what needs to happen sometimes, I think, of children and parents or caregivers, is that I don't need to gild the feelings. Maybe I just need to provide a set of limits. It's okay to feel angry. It's not okay to throw something against the wall. And I think sometimes that's where there's a confusion, is that we often get uncomfortable with someone's anger, loneliness, fear, anxiety, pain, hurt, and we're afraid of how they're going to express it, not so much that they're having it. So some of the work that I might do with parents of grieving kids is, hey, it's okay for them to feel this, and when they act out, that's probably what's going on. What you can do is maybe set limits around, it's okay to feel angry. I sometimes feel angry. It's not okay to do this. It's not okay to throw things at somebody. It's not okay to hit. It's not okay to, you can choose to do this instead.
Why don't we stay with children for a while now, and we may go kind of back and forth, and not that the two groups of clients are mutually exclusive. I'm sure there's some similarities. I mean, even with adults, you're talking about it's not okay to throw something or hit someone or whatever. That could be a limit that you might need to share with someone who's 8 or 40.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, but let's stay with children, because I know you've worked with this quite a bit with grief in children. I know you have extensive experience in dealing with children who have suffered a serious loss, and you've been involved in this grief camp, and have worked at that for how many years?
It's my 10th year.
10th? Wow, I didn't know. When you're this old, boy, it doesn't seem like that many years. Well, if you could, why don't you talk a little bit about the camp that you've worked at, and your experiences with children there for the past now 10 years?
I work at every year around July, early August. I spend 1 week of my time, along with about 65 other volunteers, working at what's called Camp El Tesoro de la Vida, which is the Treasure of Life in English. It is sponsored by Campfire USA out of Fort Worth, Texas. The camp has been around, I think this is the 21st year of Camp El Tesoro de la Vida. Camp El Tesoro is actually a resident camp that Campfire USA has several camps throughout the summer. We usually are the last camp of the season for them. And it's a resident camp. De La Vida is a resident camp for children between ages 6 and 16 who are grieving the loss of a significant other, typically a parent or a sibling. Sometimes a grandparent, sometimes an uncle or an aunt or something like that, but it usually is somebody who's very close to them, who maybe serves as a caretaker or they see or interact with on a daily basis. I typically work with the group of children that are 8, 9, and 10. The camp is like any other camp. It's a resident camp. Kids do bows and arrows, canoes, swim. If somebody were just to walk into the camp and not know what they're walking into, it would look like any other resident camp. The unique quality is that every child that's there, and most of, if not all, the volunteers that are there have experienced some loss, some significant loss in their life. And what's also unique is we have opening and closing ceremonies that focus on grief. And we have an hour of group for each group of children a day. I typically, each therapist, there's 5 therapists on the staff, and we will see 3, maybe 4 groups each morning of the weekdays that we're there. Children get there on Sunday, they leave the following Saturday, and each of those weekdays, each child will participate in their age group, their cabin age group and gender group in group. The camp is, in my opinion, amazing. I've seen more changes in a child in a week there than I may see in a child in my own practice in 6 months or a year. And probably, some people will ask me, well, why is that? Why would a child have such a unique experience in this camp environment? And there's a couple things that I've identified, and there's many more, I believe. But the couple things that are most unique about that is that the camp is very much a marathon group. They go to group during camp, but honestly, I believe that's just like a touchstone. Then they leave group, and they're with all of their buddies at swimming or crafts or whatever, and they wind up talking about stuff. And they talk about what I think polite adults would consider to be some of the most gruesome stuff. So you saw them be crushed under the car, and you saw all the blood, and oh yeah, I saw that, and I watched my dad get shot, and there was blood everywhere, and a limb was severed, or things that we would think to be really impolite, improper things to talk about. Kids talk about there, and they need to talk about those things because they're curious about them. Usually in their peer groups at school, a lot of their friends haven't lost somebody. So they feel unusual, so they don't talk about it. And then their behaviors get exacerbated because they don't know how to express it. Because maybe at home, they can't express it either because their caregivers, their surviving caregivers, are going through their own grief experience. So they go to the camp. They find these other kids that, wow, they're willing to talk about, they've had as gruesome a death occur in their lives as I have. And they bond on that. And they, at the very least, know that somebody else, in fact, several other people, have experienced a loss. Some of them are doing worse than I am. Some of them are doing much better than I am. And they wind up being this link. This kid comes and they wind up wanting to help the kids that are not doing as well as they are. And they wind up wanting what the kids who are doing better than they are have. So I'd love to say that all the therapists and all the volunteers are what it is. And I think we play a very important part, and we're necessary, and it's good that we're there. But what really happens is kids connecting with each other. So another thing that is interesting and I think kind of unique about the camp is that we do have these volunteers, about 65 volunteers, and we have about 100 kids on average. So that's a really nice ratio. And the volunteers are people, most of them have returned year after year. And some of these kids children can come up to 3 years. So some of these bonds that occur where we only see each other once, for 1 week out of a year, that can mean a lot to a child as well. There's some where I have had a major shake in my life foundation. Here's something that is stable, that I know I can go to and rely on.
Well, sounds like that the camp, not just for children, but for the volunteers, for you personally, is just a powerful experience. And
sure.
And I get, as I listen to you, and I'm trying to imagine these kids there at the camp. What is so much of a contrast to outpatient individual therapy. They come, if they come to your office to see you once a week for 45 minutes or however long it is, that's just one little bit of their week, instead of just being really kind of thrown into this culture and not only and almost kind of like dipped into something, and that they're surrounded by people who understand what they're going through, who have experienced what they're going through, or in the case of the other kids, they're currently experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just so cool that kids can view this as normal and talk about it, you know, and feel it, and they're validated by all of those things. It's just to me, I'm not even there. I've heard you talk about it before, but I just think it's such a gift to those kids and to everyone who's a part of it.
It is. I dare say those of us who volunteer to work with those kids probably have as much of an experience as the kids do. In fact, there's been times where volunteers have had, and many of the volunteers have had their own grief. In fact, some volunteers were kids at the camp, and they become old enough to come and volunteer. That's how moved a lot of people feel about being there. But it's not unusual for any one of us to have our own process occur, which is another thing. To kind of go back to what I've learned about grief. Grief isn't just about death. It isn't a physical or biological death. It can be about many things. Loss of a job, change of a job, moving to a new place, losing a pet. There's all kinds of things that count as grief reactions. And what's interesting about the camp is that for adults, and you know what? It's not. Well, I'm sorry. I'll stay with one thought at a time. For the adults that are there, often it'll touch a grief reaction for them, and we do a lot of debriefing and a lot of processing amongst ourselves, because maybe something that a child mentioned about, for example, a child might mention, well, my father died, and my mother wasn't working, and now she has to go back to work, and it's been very hard on her. Maybe there's an adult who's in. By the way, adults participate in the groups as well. Adult may have gone through that experience of maybe they didn't lose a spouse, but maybe their spouse lost a job, and now they're having to find work, and that experience comes up for them. So to say it's just about the death, the biological death, and getting over that of these children, it would be minimizing it. It doesn't linearly. People don't move along linearly. It's more like a exponential effect. Another thing about that, as I was about to touch on, is at the camp, children not only work through the grief of the person that they've lost, but they work through the grief of having to live. So again, I'll go back to the loss of a parent. Maybe one parent has died and they're living now with the surviving parent. Maybe that surviving parent they didn't have a very good relationship with, and so now they're grieving the fact that this parent helped me get along with that parent, and I've lost them, and now I have to figure out how to get along with this parent. So it's not just about grieving the loss of that loved one. It's often grieving a lifestyle, which is I guess probably another thing I've learned about working with people who are grieving is that it's not just about the loss of a person. It's a loss of how I lived life, and it's going to be different now. And that can sometimes serve for someone to roll down the hill, and sometimes it can serve as a touchstone for growth in some people. It's really, actually, many people will say to me, how do you work with people who grieve? And to me, it's actually very exciting, because it's a way, there's a sink or swim quality about working with grieving individuals. And it touches on my own grief. I have to grow myself. It's really pretty exciting, actually.
Well, when you talk about the ripple effect of some of these experiences, like that example you said of the parent who survived is the parent that you're maybe not as close to as the one who died, and that really your life has changed or shifted because of this. I guess I'm reminded of the fact that we all like familiar things, and we don't like things to change unless we want them to change. Even if we want them to change, we may not want, it may be difficult to go through that, and so we like the familiar. It's really, it can be a pretty scary thing to lose our routine, our familiar kinds of things. Well, the camp just sounds, you talked about meaning, making meaning, and growing from this experience, and And obviously, if these volunteers are coming back year after year, I mean, this is a meaningful experience for you and for all these volunteers, in addition to the kids who are there. And obviously, all of you believe in the camp. It's I just think it's really a very cool thing. Well, let's talk a little bit more about children and the grief process that they go through compared to adults. I mean, you said you contrasted a little bit that kids at the camp talk about brutal things, arms being cut off or some witnessing a shooting. How would you compare therapy with grieving children to therapy with grieving adults?
Well, the first thing I think of in that is that typically therapy with children, children typically don't come to a therapist because they want to. They typically come because a parent has or a caregiver has sent them. And so usually that means that they're acting out in some way that is uncomfortable for caregivers. So that immediately makes me think of children typically act out their grief or their bereavement, where in my experience, adults typically kind of act in their experience. I have to continue working, I have to continue maintaining my family, continue being productive, so I need to get back to the rituals of life. And so a lot of adults I experience often will kind of put away their feelings. And now that isn't to say that their behavior doesn't change in response to their grief. They may act out, but it isn't necessarily their modus operandi, where with children it's just almost a given that they're going to act out their grief rather than internalize. That's not probably the correct term of internalize. I think children do internalize their grief, but they express it by acting out and not talking about it. For example, many children, whether they've been trained that way by caregivers or just what they observe, don't necessarily say, I'm really hurting right now and I need somebody to support me. What they'll do instead is they'll act out. There'll be a behavior change that's significant. At school, their grades go down. They may look to be oppositional defiant. They may be depressive, where before they were very engaging at school and did a lot of activities and were very involved in their studies. Now they don't do any of that. So they act out, where an adult might still maintain those things. And in fact, you might go, have you grieved, to an adult? And they may, oh yeah, I'm fine, I'm okay, everything's fine. And they may very well maintain their appearance while they may be crumbling inside. So both of them are going through an experience. I just noticed that children seem to act it out more, where adults seem to take it in more. I think of in working with. Some people have asked me, well, is it easier to work with adults or is it easier to work with children? And I don't know if that's an apples and oranges question. I mean, it just depends on the individual, whether they're a child or an adult. But I have found that if I can facilitate an experience for a child that typically is activity oriented, it's much easier than talk therapy with them. So for example, Sandtray would be a much easier medium to help a child express than it would be to ask them, how are you feeling right now and how are you handling your grief? Where with some adults, that might very well be possible. How are you taking care of yourself? How are you expressing your grief? And they may very well be able to talk about it. With children, I find that to be more difficult. Even as they get into their teens, that often is more difficult.
Well, let's stay with Sandtray and other activity-oriented interventions just for a minute. So you said that. I mean, I do think, and of course, we know each other, and we believe in an activity-based approach with kids, and we've been using with young kids, and I'm guessing that you don't do play therapy with the kids there at the camp per se. I mean, it's not like a playroom, individual
No.
play therapy, but the same philosophy, really a play or an activity-based philosophy. Obviously, Santre is a type of play therapy, and an activity therapy like we learned at UNT is also. So with Santre, talk a little about how you've used Santre at the camp, some of what you've seen kids. Now you do this in groups. Is it group
Exactly.
Santre? So talk a little bit about how that works and some lessons you've learned about how to do it, not to do it, how things you've seen kids do with Santre, that kind of stuff.
Well, one of the things, Alan Wolfelt, who is well published and is a pretty prominent writer and presenter in grief, especially with children, talks about the tasks of the grieving child. And the first task that he lists is being able to express the loss outside of oneself, which often is the way I start our groups. Say Monday morning at this camp that I'm a part of. Our first group, I may facilitate, in addition, part of the first day is getting to know one another, but part of what I might do in helping us get to know one another is, whether using Santre or another medium, is I might have them create a scene around, describe a scene with the person in your life who's died. It's something very simple. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't even have to be, tell us the worst fear you have or the worst memory. It's just describe any scene you want to express. And through that, and I will often use Santre to start off that process. And children will create a scene. And that scene can be anything from a time that we went to the baseball game to the funeral when we were burying them. So that to me, using a medium like Santre also it's kind of a nice barometer for how prepared this person is to present what's going on with them. Maybe they create a scene. When I ask them describe a memory of the person in your life who's died, they may create a scene where everything is happy and everything is great, and it talks nothing about their loss. They don't want to talk about the loss. Another person may create, like as I just pointed out, the graveyard scene. In fact, I had one child the first day when I gave that prompt of create a scene about the person in your life who's died. They did the graveyard scene of everybody at the funeral, and the child not only buried the person in a little casket, they buried themselves next to the person, not in a casket, but they buried themselves next to the person in the sand. And another person may just talk very simply about how I feel guilty that the person in my life has died, because I'm actually happy that they've died. Because maybe it was a grandparent who was going through years of a painful death, and they now feel happy that they've died, and they feel guilty because they felt happy in that anticipatory grief. There's a variety of different scenes that can be created, but each one of them sort of give me a snapshot of where somebody is and what they want to present. And that goes back a little bit to that, giving that prompt and having that medium where they can create whatever they want to create in the sand. And I don't have to interpret it for them, but they can make the interpretation. It not only does a lot for telling me where they are, it does a lot for establishing their comfort level in the group. There's often, after we have an opportunity for everyone to go around in the group and present their scene, I offer an opportunity to, maybe somebody has a question about somebody else's scene. And if it's okay with that person, maybe they could ask a question, or they could make an observation. They could just point and say, I noticed this. And that person can choose to answer. They can choose to elaborate, or they can choose to say, I don't want to talk about that right now. More often than not, kids want to talk about the other scene, and what they often want to do is talk. It relates to something that's gone on with them. So, or they're just really curious. The example I gave you of the child who buried themselves next to the dead parent, the buried parent. Many kids wanted to ask about that. Well, why did you bury yourself? You're not dead. And there is no one interpretation, to be made. The child can make several different interpretations that maybe they hadn't thought about. I don't know if that child consciously thought that day that, okay, I need to create some kind of scene somewhere where I'm buried in the dirt next to my parent. They just created it, and to me, that's kind of the magic of sand tray and other expressive art activities, is that they bring up what maybe somebody wasn't even conscious or aware of, especially with children. But by the way, I think equally that medium is equally useful with adults, obviously, which clearly you understand and promote.
Yeah, and we will here in a little bit. We'll get to sand tray with adults. I guess one of the things that I don't know what the viewers are thinking as they listen to you describe this interaction between kids, but to me, what I'm aware of, and you and I are both group counseling people and believe in the value of group counseling. What I'm struck by as I listen to you talk about it is that in a way, I'm assuming that in some ways that when one kid says to another kid, who they're both 9 years old or whatever, one kid says, "Why did you bury yourself? You're not dead," that in a way a kid's got more latitude or can do that more than the therapist can, that it's less threatening, that it's really facilitative. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking of how ping pongs, kind of bounce off of one another, that I'm guessing that sometimes that you kind of set the ground rule, right? Like you can make a comment or ask a question, the other person doesn't have to respond, and that ground rule is very important. You can respond or not, and I can see how important that is. But then you set that, so you kind of structure it, and then a lot of the process, the growth process, the facilitator process, is what they do with each other. Mm-hmm. And it just sounded really very therapeutic and facilitative, some of these comments they make to each other.
Sure, it's it's that therapeutic factor that Yalom talks about. There's there's a universality. Oh wow, somebody else one of my peers has had the same kind of experience I have, obviously, and that gives them license to talk with each other, to interact with each other. The group process I've found to be just invaluable in working with something like sand tray. For one, being fairly, well, I'm joking, of course, when I say I'm being kind of lazy and not having much imagination myself. It does a lot of the work for me. Sure. I kind of, to use a joke that we often do, I kind of roll the ball in the middle of the floor and I let them go with it with certain ground rules. And they usually do great with it. And some children choose to respond to the prompts that are given, that other children asking, "Why are you buried? You're not dead." Some kids may come back with, "Well, I am dead. And I died when my dad died. Or I'll never be the same again." The younger, especially the younger a child gets, "Well, if I could be with them, then maybe they'll come back." Or if I can be with them, I won't ever be lonely. So there's a variety of different reactions that can occur, based upon development, based upon just where they are with their grief process. And it's important that they express that. The other nice thing about group is that a lot of kids have things happen without ever having to say a word. They can watch other kids do their process in the tray, and they can observe what two other kids are doing and grow themselves and never had to have said a word, which is another thing. Like some kids, or some people, adults, do better when they don't necessarily have to say much. Or have an outward experience, but they are having an internal experience.
And when in a group, when when I'm the focus person, it's for some people that can be a little scary, and they might tense up and they might be more guarded. Whereas when I'm listening to someone else talk, my guard's down. I'm just kind of taking it in, and I can learn. I mean, I just think that's another benefit and an advantage of group, is you get to see what someone else is going through and learn from that. I just think it's fascinating to listen to.
I'll give you, we were talking about making meaning a minute ago, and specifically around a sand tray experience, this particular thing happened. A child, and it had been, this is probably Thursday of the week-long experience, and most kids, in my experience at this camp, will, initially some of them may be resistant towards it, but they get in there and they find out, wow, these other kids are okay, they've lost somebody like I have, there's fun activities to do, and they engage. And then they get sucked into the having sort of an experience that isn't just fun, but also they're grieving at the same time, and it just takes care of itself. Other kids are more resistant. I would say most kids get into it, but some don't. Well, this one particular child, by Thursday, they had been there since the previous Sunday, was not really engaging. He wasn't engaging in group much. He was very depressive. He wasn't oppositional or anything. He just really didn't. He wasn't willing to have much of an experience.
Sounds stuck too.
Stuck is probably the best word. And we did a sand tray. We were actually really running late on kind of describing the person in your life who's died is what we were doing at that point. And this kid, his dad was crushed by a car, and the child observed it. The car fell on the dad and killed him instantly, and it was a very gory, bloody scene. And this kid had so intellectualized the experience, he could tell you every bloody, gory detail from beginning to end without having any emotion around it. And so he was describing yet again his experience with no emotion. And he was talking about, and his dad worked on cars for a living. This was an accident, and so the kid put the scene together of the car falling on his dad in the tray. And it was exactly as you can imagine. There was a car. We had cars. Obviously, we had a variety of figurines for the children to use in the activity. And there was a figure under the car. And he had even taken some like reddish leaf material to put under the car to describe the blood that was involved. And at one point, I had opened it up for kids to say, well, maybe some of you have something that you'd like to say or an observation you'd like to make, or maybe you want to ask a question. And so it's okay for you to just take it in or not say anything. You don't have to say anything. And is it okay if they do that? And he sort of nodded, said, yeah, it's okay for people to say something. And, several kids had something to say. And this one kid says, wow, so your dad would get underneath cars and he would fix cars like that and get underneath that car? And the kid kind of said, yeah, he would do that. And he'd go, wow, your dad's a really brave guy. I'd never do something like that. I could never be that brave. And this kid sort of snapped out of something. And he actually said, yeah, my dad was a really brave guy. And that was the first opportunity this kid had. What I see that as is the child had an opportunity to make meaning, not so much of his dad's death, but of his dad's life. And what he took from that is that my dad's a really brave guy, and he did what he liked doing. And then he went even further by the end of camp to be able to make meaning of, I want to be brave, and I want to do whatever I want to do in life too. And that happened all through that sand tray experience and the group process that happened in it. I don't think that would have happened if we would have tried to do that through talking. I think it needed to happen through an activity medium. I think it also would have been, it wouldn't have happened if we wouldn't have had another child there. Because again, what a lot of kids will say to me is, well, you're here, you have to be here. You're an adult, you're supposed to care about me. Other kids don't have to care about me. And when other kids care about me, it means something. And so for that kid to say, wow, your dad was a really brave guy, I could never do something like that, that meant a lot to him. And that happened through the sand tray medium.
Well, as I listened to that, that's such a great story. As I listened to what happened between the kids, your dad is a brave guy. I would never go under that. I guess one thing that struck me as I'm listening is what a surprising kind of thing that turned out to be something that helped this kid get unstuck. I mean,
I never planned for that to happen. No, I couldn't have ever imagined that being useful.
And who could guess that a statement like that from another kid would be something that kind of got this guy out of stuck depressive mode? Mm-hmm. And also, I guess one thing as I was listening to you, and I think it's easy to kind of overlook this, is you said what it helped him do was not focus so much on his dad's death, but focus on his dad's life. Mm-hmm. And I mean, how important is that? I mean, even when you think about whether it's kids or adults, part of what I miss about this person really has nothing to do with the death. It has to do with he's not here or she's not here to have this experience together, mm-hmm. you know? And so remembering the person's life is meaningful. And then obviously he even was able to shift to say, I want to be like my dad. I want to be brave like my dad. And boy, that's just such a powerful thing too.
Well, and he went on further to say, I not only want to be brave like my dad, but I want to go do what I want to do. He saw his dad as doing what he wanted to do in life and being kind of in charge of his own destiny. And the child was able to kind of take a little piece of that with him. And again, there's no way I could have ever imagined that happening in that scene. That I could have even seen that being a very throwaway comment by that child. It was nice and supportive, but you know, okay, who's next? So I guess the lesson in that for me was, you know, everything that's said can have meaning. The process that goes on is very meaningful, and it's important, probably more for me to not be as much a doer in the group as a facilitator. So often for me, it's very much how can I step back and let them have the process and run the process and facilitate where needed, where it's sometimes it's needed, obviously. Putting rules in and making, you know, sometimes you have one kid who's going to express outwardly a little more than, or whatever. You need to be there to facilitate, but for the most part, they are capable, and obviously I believe the same with adults, is that they are capable of doing their process. To me providing any kind of feedback or even processing the activity, and this might even be a little contrary to what we've learned at North Texas or what have you on activity therapy or whatever. To me, the process that we talk about is kind of icing on the cake. The cake is the child or the adult doing what they need to do. And when they do that, things, I mean, from my own experience of doing, I have all kinds of touchstones, all kinds of things come up. And yes, it's important to process it, but it's the big mound, is getting to do it first. And the process is important, but it's kind of an icing on the cake to me. So I don't worry so much about how important and how imperative this process is for the kid. It's more important that they get to do it, in a structured way. You know, I do all the things in sand tray work that I think a lot we've learned in activity work of providing time limits and providing structure, maybe a prompt or two. Sometimes maybe using this number of figurines if we have a limited number and so many children. There's certain things I put in place, but I'm very respectful of it's their process. I need to let them have it, and I don't need to mold it for them. I don't need to make something good that isn't. If a kid presents an incredibly dark scene, it isn't necessarily my job to find what's positive in that. It often is it's important for me to facilitate him having a process around this is what's really dark for me. And I feel the same way with adults as I would with kids on that.
Well, one thing that is apparent as I listen to you talk about that, several things you just said, is you're comfortable getting into those dark areas and you're comfortable with anger or whatever the experience is, even the gruesome quality of some of this stuff. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe some of that is hard to listen to. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and I even remember the first year I did this, and I'd hear these kids. We'd have the first day. We'd have the first group Monday morning, and Monday night. One of my jobs is to kind of go do bed checks. I just kind of go with my flashlight around my cabins and just kind of check in. How are guys doing? And one day, one of the cabin buddies, or one of the cabin counselors, is what they are, a volunteer, stops me about halfway out, and he goes, "Hey, just stand here in the dark and just listen to what they're doing." And this one kid who was incredibly resistant about talking about his mom, who was shot to death in a drive-by, didn't want to talk about that. They're in the cabin, and they're all giggling about, because more than one kid in that cabin had lost a parent to a shooting. And they were even kind of laughing about what blood looks like, or they were even kind of doing shooting and pretending to fall down and all that. And it sounded like, how could they make such light of a gruesome thing? But they needed to do that. They needed to find the play in, if you will, they need to find what's playful about what they feel and think about what happened to them. And it's not that they think it's good that mom was shot to death by any means. They miss her very much, but they need to, some way or another, they need to act that out or play that out. And that was their way of doing it. And they were also talking with each other, and they found out that, yeah, there's other kids who've lost somebody the way who else would have had a drive-by shooting happen and my mom gets shot? There's another kid in my cabin who had that happen.
And who else would have let me do what they were doing? Let's act out the shooting, yuck it up,
Or
talk about blood.
Caretakers would say, we don't do that.
No,
how could you talk about that?
Yeah, and so there's not the taboo on that kind of stuff with their peer group, and in play therapy and sand tray therapy, that just part of the belief in the process is that this activity, whether you're arranging miniatures to create scenes, or with play therapy, whether you're using the dollhouse or dolls or other kinds of play medium to act out things, that acting out is valuable and it's therapeutic, and so the child in this case is finding a way to get through this. And it doesn't fit neatly into what adults would do. But that whole, that's just a great story of listen to what they're doing and all of that, and seeing how the way they're working it out is not at all what you would have guessed. It reminds me of that comment about the brave father. You just can't guess that. And I guess it reminds me of what you said about the icing on the cake. A lot of the cake is kind of spontaneous and natural, and they're interacting with each other, and what an amazing thing.
You had asked me about some of the things, and I know we're venturing around a little bit, but just to kind of wrap up a little bit of what you'd said, well, what are some of the things that you use sand tray for in group? Another thing that I found sand tray to be extremely useful for in the group process is I try and have some piece in working with a grieving child specifically, but I think this is also important with adults, is it's almost like it's like the miracle question and solution focus there. If I could have anything happen from this day forward, short of the person in my life who's died coming back to life, I usually put that caveat in there. What would I want to have happen? And I'll use the sand tray medium to do that activity. And what I find is really interesting is the number of kids that some want to they want it to go back to the way I want to go back to playing baseball. And my dad, so they put a baseball scene together. Well, they haven't played baseball for a year and a half now because Dad and I used to play baseball a lot. And every time I play baseball, I cry and I get bent out of shape and I don't like the way I feel, but I want to go back to that. And the number of kids that wind up going back to, I want to get back to life. I want to get back to living. And the medium of sand tray is such a it's not just a visual, but a tactile and such a sensory experience for kids. They kind of get into the sand and they'll dig in and they'll put some little figurine somewhere. And all. It's a real rich experience. And it's not that this kid is going to get right back to playing baseball when they leave the camp, but it's an opportunity for them to express, this is what I want my life to get. I want my life to be this. Sometimes it's, the family lost our house after the caregiver died. This is what it's going to look like for me when I'm a parent. I'm going to have a 2-story house, and I'm going to have a fence with sheep and cattle and all this other kinds of stuff. So they get to project a little bit of, this is what I want my life to be. And an important part about that is that it doesn't include my parent physically being there, but often there's hints of that parent with them. My dad or my mom my mom or my dad were she flew a plane, or she was an engineer or whatever, and I want to be, I want to do that. Or is it important that they become that or not? No, but they get to express right now, here and now, this is what I want. I want some life, as opposed to my parent is dead, there's nothing for me anymore. And there's nowhere for me to go.
Yeah, and one thing I'm thinking of as I listen to that is there's nothing for me, there's nowhere for me to go, is kind of this feeling of my life is over, which of course a lot of adults say too.
Sure.
It's I can't do this, so my life is over, as opposed to I want to live. What can I do with my life? What means something? What direction do I want to go? I mean, that's just anything that's going to catalyze that is valuable. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like at the camp, Sand Tray is a part of this movement. Well, one of the things you mentioned a while back was anticipatory grief. Could you talk more about that and just give us some examples? I think you already gave one.
Well, I'll just talk. I can talk personally. In my family, really both my grandparents on my mother's side had very long death. Well, how do I put this? They suffered a long time before dying, where it appeared that they were suffering from terminal illness, say 5 or 6 years before their death, and when I think of the term anticipatory grief, I remember vividly my grandfather was having all kinds of health problems and things being diagnosed, and then there was that call in the middle of the night from my grandmother. Oh, your grandfather's not doing okay. We need help. Okay, great. Run over and take him to the hospital. And of course, it's a huge grief experience, and this is it. He might be close to dying. He was gray, when we saw him, and he pulls through. And we take him back home the next day or the day after that, maybe. So a week goes by. Call in the middle of the night. Oh my gosh, I think your grandfather is dying. We take it. We call the ambulance, or we take him ourselves, or whatever, and we take him to the hospital. This must be it. He's dying. He looks gray. He looks old, tired. How could he live? And he pulls through. And we do that, whether it be once a week, or maybe once a month, or once every couple of months, or once every 6 months for the next 5, 6, maybe 7 years. I went from having an immediate, oh my gosh, he's dying, to almost a, wow, here we go again. I wonder how this is gonna go. And I remember vividly thinking, wow, I feel so guilty that I'm thinking this, because I love him. I want the best for him. I don't want him to suffer. And here I am going, oh, come on, is it another call in the middle of the night? I'm almost being angry that I'm being bothered. And I was anticipating his death, from the first incident of him dying. Well, the process was going to take much longer. By the time we'd gotten close to the end, I had run out of grief, so to speak. I was now getting into anger and frustration and hurt that he's not the same person that I knew, and so I had been anticipating his death for a very long time, and by the time he died, I felt guilt that I had thought those things about him. And I think that that's just something that goes along with anticipatory grief, the anticipating a loss that doesn't always come when I think that it will or when I want it to, or it doesn't work on my schedule, so to speak. And I think it's a very common occurrence with people that anticipate a loss, whether it be a physical, biological death, or whether it be moving or getting a new job or whatever. I'm waiting on this new job and it hasn't come through, or I'm waiting for a job, and in these times that's something that a lot of people are going through. And I go through a myriad of feelings that are very easy to expect at the beginning of the process: fear, loneliness, grief, and by the end of, when it really comes down to the actual event occurring, I might feel very differently. In the case of my grandfather dying, I remember feeling all those feelings that I've described, but I also felt incredible guilt because I had found myself wishing that he was dying, or wishing he would just die. And part of that obviously is that I just wanted the best for him. And at this point, dying would have been the best thing. But I also, to be completely honest, kind of was tired of going through this. I didn't want to go through this experience anymore. And I think most of us have that happen. It's just real hard to admit. It's counterintuitive. This is a person I love and I want them to die. It doesn't make sense. So that's when talking about anticipatory grief, I think that's an incident that's very common in people who are anticipating a loss.
So I guess I'm thinking, even though you gave earlier an example of a child, it sounds like with adults that would be probably, in many situations, not an uncommon experience at all.
I don't even think with a child it would be uncommon.
Yeah. And so I guess some of the more common things I'm thinking of are situations is if you're married to someone who dies from cancer, that would, and it drags out for a pretty long time, or any other kind of major illness, ALS or whatever, that's a protracted, lengthy kind of thing, that it sounds like it would just be such a draining experience on the person, and so your initial kind of, when you talked about grief stages earlier, it's like it changes the dynamics of everything. It's not like the typical kind of experience if someone dies suddenly. It would just be everything changes.
Sure. As you said, the term protracted is a pretty nice term. The length or the not knowing and things not working the way I expect or want changes. It can often change how grief occurs. In my experience, often I have all those traditional feelings at the beginning of this experience. And for me, it was, okay, the first time we had to take my granddad to the hospital in the middle of the night. Loneliness, sadness, fear. Oh, wow, it's really going to happen now. And it doesn't. And we kind of just keep on going, and those feelings sort of slender out, and maybe even I start getting more angry, frustrated, longing for it to happen. Please, God, just make something happen, And whether it be with children or adults, either one, I think that's very common. In fact, I don't think it's uncommon in the experience I've had for a kid to say, when are they going to die? Why won't they just die? And of course, that's how rude that is. How can you say that? But in a way, a child is just sort of saying what a lot of people may very well be feeling. Not that they don't love them, not that they don't wish that they were there and alive and vibrant, but kind of one of those enough already feelings.
Yeah, the child's just more brutally honest about it and saying maybe things that the adult is feeling and thinking, but would never say because of being too polite. I guess one thought that I had as you're talking about anticipatory grief is that the suffering, if someone's going through cancer, well, what a horrible thing to go through, or ALS, I can't think of anything worse. Mm-hmm. But they're not the only person who's suffering. That when you described your experience a minute ago, it's certainly a type of suffering.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, there's something and I've kind of hinted towards it, which may be a little off topic, but I think it's an important point to put out there. is that, you know, there's not just when we talk about grief and bereavement, I think we often think it's about this biological death, but there's other types. You know, gosh, you know, we haven't even talked about, what about when you have people that linger forever, maybe are on life support, and everything about them is not them, but their heartbeat remains and there's some level of brain function. And there's that going to the hospital and visiting them and maintaining sort of this vigil around the bed when they might not ever physiologically die. And there's that. There's also the forms of death that we experience just in change of life. You know, when I change jobs, when I move to a new town, when my parents divorce, whether I be a child or an adult, whatever, there is a loss. There is a life that is ended in one way or another, and that form and those kinds of grief should not be treated with any less importance than a biological death. I think in school environments, you know, the kid who's going to be moving or has just moved into the school district. Maybe they were a big man on campus where they came from, and now they're being picked on every day. You know, that's grief. Or moving to a new town for a new job. Well, come on, get over it. You're in a new and you're in a better town. I mean, hey, you were in Des Moines, and now you're in Los Angeles, California, and it's sunny. Don't you love it more? And maybe they do, but you know what? Maybe they also have had a loss, and they're missing things. So those forms of death, and I would refer to them as death, are not to be any. They're not any less important than if we lose a loved one.
And I guess I hear a lot of adults trivialize those kinds of losses and minimize them. You know, even the death of a pet. I've heard adults minimize and trivialize that with kids, and obviously that can be a very painful loss to a child.
If you go to the bookstore and you go in the children's book section, there are several books on pet loss and how to explain to your child death through pet loss. And what's interesting about that is it can be kind of a metaphor for lack of a better term, bigger losses you're going to have in life, the death of a parent or grandparent or what have you.
Yeah. Well, I think finally maybe we can finish up with this last topic, and that's the topic of complicated grief. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Complicated grief typically is, and there's a lot of banter on this. I mean, I think there's a lot to still be said on what complicated grief is, or a lot to be learned on what complicated grief is. But, you know, diagnostically speaking, you know, it's described as often looking like a mix of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So normal grief, you know, is typically perceived as the normal process that somebody may go through when they experience a loss. That may look like depression. They may retreat from their normal activities in life. They might not engage in friendships like they did before, or you know, the normalcy of life. And it's generally perceived that normal grief, with a little bit of encouragement by friends and family, going through your own process, thinking through it, expressing feelings somehow or another, I'll return to sort of I will rise, you know, from the ashes, so to speak, and kind of get back to life. Complicated grief would be all of that stuff. And by the way, to point out too, something with normal grief, even, you know, I mentioned those qualities. I think it's also important to point out that things like hallucination are not uncommon for normal grief. And I'll give you a lesser example and a greater example. A lesser example is somebody I just lost my spouse. And I'm walking down a busy street in downtown, and across the street, I see him or her. I see her walking across the street. I see her. That's her. No, that's her. No, you think somebody that looks like her. No, it really is her. And I may see that, and clearly it's probably not her. But at least we don't know. But we're probably not her. Or maybe auditory hallucinations. You know, I'm in the kitchen cooking something, and I hear her in another room in the house, like I would, like if I cooked normally, and she might say something to me. And those things are very real, and they're also fairly normal. So I guess kind of going back to lessons that I learned, or if there was some piece of advice to give, is I don't have to necessarily lose it and think that I need to diagnose this person yet if they've just had a loss and these things are happening. So with that said, going back into complicated grief, it's really normal grief, just forever. If I've gone many months, maybe even a year, and really things haven't changed. In fact, maybe they've even I've decompensated a little bit more, then that would be identified as complicated grief. Well, the thing that can go along with complicated grief often is that if I, kind of like PTSD in a way, if I perceive that there's some danger to me in this, that often can be a precursor to complicated grief. So for a kid, if mom or dad die, complicated grief is a likely possibility because they are a big part of my survival. If my grandparent dies, who lives in Michigan, and I see him a couple times a year, I see him at Christmas and I see him in the summer for a week, yeah, I'm going to miss him, but maybe not quite as complicated because I don't rely on them for my own survival. Well, the same can happen for, we talk about elderly, or I'm not even thinking of elderly, I'm thinking I've been married for almost 6 years, and if my wife died, she's become a big part of my existence, so there might be some complication in her death. Someone's been married 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, like my grandparents were married 70 years. When my grandfather died, my grandmother was experiencing a lot of complicated grief because he had become such a part of her existence. So the more entrenched the individual, or the more entrenched the loss, the more, I believe, the higher incident of complicated grief. And it often, especially when we're talking about kids, it's often about survival. If they're a big part of me living, then it's going to get complicated when they're not there anymore. And for kids, it obviously can be, as we talked about earlier, a lot more acting out. For adults, it can be more decompensating. They won't engage. They continue with hallucination. They continue with denial. No, they're not really dead. They're coming back. Or, no, we don't need to take care of that stuff. It'll all work itself out. Hey, Mom, if we don't call the bank, it's pretty soon we're going to lose the house. But, well, no, we're going to be fine. It's going to be okay. And those can be things that can be signs of complicated grief. And they're concerning. And that's where maybe some more, sometimes psychiatric care might be necessary. But even more so, maybe a little bit more aggressive care might be necessary, more cognitive, behavioral work. But nevertheless, there's no one answer for how to make it better. And there is still somewhere in there, though, like we talked about meaning making earlier, there's got to be some meaning there. I've got to find some meaning to attach to. Otherwise, what is the point? If I don't have meaning in life, why go on? Probably any of us could make some comment about that, and it's probably more so with the person who's experiencing complicated grief.
Well, I guess one thought I have as I listen to you talk about complicated grief is when we were talking about with normal grief that the process will tend to unfold a certain way and be with the client where he is and those kinds of things. Let the process work and let the person move. Sounds like with complicated grief that's going to be more problematic, that it won't necessarily unfold that way. They may need more intervention.
Yeah. Well, or with normal grief, often therapy isn't necessarily prescribed.
Right.
You wouldn't necessarily need to talk to somebody outside of your normal group that helps take care of you. But I think usually complicated grief is usually where somebody's introduced to therapy, whether it be a child or an adult. And it may not necessarily be, it might very well be the same things we've talked about that assist with the complicated grief experience. If I am there to listen and I'm there to be with you and present and take on any of this dark stuff you've got going on without trying to pat you on the back and tell you it's going to be okay. In my experience, and I think I could be oversimplifying a little bit, but I sort of believe in my gut. One of the most important things about grief, whether it be normal or complicated, is just to be able to do what I need to do. As long as it doesn't hurt anybody else or myself, it's important to be able to talk about, I hated his guts, but I'm also sad that he died. We were going to divorce, and in a way, I find myself happy that she's dead. That way, I didn't have to, I've talked with people who've had that kind of experience, and if I just can be there and hear it and not have a judgmental ear, sometimes that's enough. We can just facilitate that happening. Same with children. As opposed to what we do in polite society, which is, I do sometimes in polite society, is give the pat on the back and I hope it's going to be okay and I'm with you. And those are good things to do, but sometimes I just need an environment where I can be ugly. The ugly stuff needs to come up. My belief is that when somebody's grieving, if they have that environment, more often than not, they're going to come out of it some way or another. And it also isn't always going to be in the time that I would like to prescribe.
Well, as we wrap up here, I guess one thought I have about what you just said is when you said giving this person the climate or the environment where he can be himself and be ugly if that's what he needs to be, and you accept it. So I think that acceptance, certainly in humanistic San Tray therapy, we stress the relationship. And even though Chris and I haven't talked about the relationship per se, it's really kind of been the grounding for a lot of what we've talked about. When you're talking about the camp, if you don't have a relationship like you do with those kids, they're not going to feel free to do those things they're doing, to interact in those ways, and that acceptance that you give them, and the climate that you create. I think that climate is just so important. And in a group, it's like individual therapy, and it's different from individual therapy. Sure. It's a different kind of climate. But I'm thinking, when I listen to you talk about that place where you can be whatever you need to be, it's a climate you're creating. They trust you to a significant degree, or they wouldn't do that. And you accept. In play therapy, we have this saying that any feeling in counseling is okay, any behavior isn't. You kind of talked about that earlier. It's okay to be angry. It's not okay to hit someone or whatever. And so I'm reminded of that again. So as we finish up here, I guess that's one idea that I would just end with, is that the relationship, whether we're talking about grieving or other issues that we deal with in humanistic San Tray therapy, the relationship and the climate are just really, really important. Well, Chris, thank you so much for this time. It's just gone by incredibly fast for me, and
me too.
I think so many things that you've shared with us are really, really helpful. So thanks for coming and being a part of this.
Thanks for having me.